The Louisiana Book Festival enjoyed its 6th year in downtown Baton Rouge, representing over 100 authors. Join us for Louisiana Book Talks as we celebrate our rich literary culture with highlights from the 2008 Louisiana Book Festival, featuring author Julia Reed. Book lovers of all ages enjoy the variety of activities offered at the Louisiana Book Festival. Between the Capitol Building and the State Library, the festival is packed with booths housing everything from storytellers to basic printmaking skills, and cartoon artists to specialty publishers. In the state capitol, authors read from their latest works, often providing personal insight to their writing. In this edition of Book Talks, we'll hear from author Julia Reed, who lives in New Orleans. In addition to authoring several books, Reed is a contributing editor to Newsweek magazine, writing their food and drink column. Her latest books include The House on First Street, My New Orleans Story, and Ham Biscuits, Hostess Gowns, and Other Southern Specialties, an entertaining life with recipes.
I've always been sort of obsessed with food, but it never occurred to me that I could make a living writing about it. And I was living in New York, where I worked for Vogue for the last 21 years, and my editor at Vogue was leaving, and I gave him a goodbye party. And so I had what I always have, which I'm sure is the same as a lot of your menus. I had ham biscuits, and I had deviled eggs, and I had a big old pile of, lumped crab meat with homemade mayonnaise, which at Galajois in New Orleans is referred to as crab meat maison. I had passed pimento cheese sandwiches. I mean, I had what I always have at cocktail parties. And well, these people went crazy. They weren't my normal friends. They were this guy's friends. And so there was an editor there from the Times, and he called me up the next morning. He's like, "Have you ever written about food?" I said, "No." But he said, would you be interested? And I said, "Sure." I mean, it literally was because the guy had never tasted a ham biscuit or a stuffed egg, and it changed his life. Which seemed astonishing to me, since, like you all, I grew up eating this stuff. But in New York, if you go to a cocktail party, you get like a sort of half-cooked snow pea pipe with some sort of unintelligible-looking fish paste or something. So I started writing for them. My first piece for them was on gelatin, because I grew up in a household where, at least half the food was congealed all the time. When I started writing the piece, I looked in all the Ginger Lee cookbooks from around my hometown, and I counted something like, out of, let's say there were 100 salad recipes, 85 of them were congealed salads. There might be, 120 desserts, 100 of them were congealed desserts. What made me think of doing it was my mother had a big house party for some friends of hers from out of town, and she wanted to be able to visit with her friends, so she made all the food ahead of time. And without thinking, she'd, every single thing was like two different kinds of tomato aspic. There was a crab meat mousse, there was dessert, there was charlotte russe, and there was strawberry mousse the next time. Everything was congealed. So like the third day, one of her guests, they were getting up from the table, and he said, "I can't get up." And my mother was like, he actually had like a problem with his knee, and she goes, "Oh my God, are you okay?" And he's like, "No, it's not that. It's just that my blood is coagulated. I don't think I can stand up." It still amazes me the difference in Southerners' attitudes about food and Northerners' attitudes about food. In my first book, Queen of the Turtle Derby, I wrote an essay about that very thing, and it was the easiest thing I've ever written, because I just sort of decided to compare our attitudes. And I went to the bookstore, and I got all the Junior League cookbooks from southern cities, and then I got they had some Junior League cookbooks from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and places like that. And so I compared the titles, and it's so our attitude, that's all you need to know. In the Jackson, Mississippi Junior League cookbook is "Come on in." There's a Louisiana one that's like "Talk About Good," 1, 2, and 3. I'm sure there are probably 5 by now. And the Yankee titles were stuff like "Posh Pantry." But then when you open up and look at the difference between what was in there, in Massachusetts they had one of the desserts was like grape nuts pudding. I don't want to eat grape nuts anyway, but I definitely don't want to put it. And then there was some Alabama Junior League book that had a dessert. Instead of grape nut puddings, it was Aunt Margie's Better Than Sex Cakes. Which would you rather eat? It's kind of a no-brainer. And then I started calling up my friends, and so I called up my friends in New York, and I said, "So what was the best meal you ever ate in your life?" And my editor at Vogue said, "Oh, easy. Last year at Danielle," which is a restaurant, not a meal. And I said, "Well, what did you eat at Danielle?" "Oh, I can't remember, but it was really good." Then I called my best friend in Greenville, Mississippi, and she goes, "Oh man, fried catfish with some okra and tomatoes," and she starts reeling off all this stuff. And I said, when did you eat it? Last night. So Southerners, their best meal is always pretty much the last meal we ate. Food is so integral to our lives and in ways so much larger and deeper than just, mere nourishment. And, that's why there's a chapter on funeral food, for example, in my first book. And I didn't realize, so it just sort of conveniently leads me into my other book, The House on First Street. I did not realize how sort of much I discussed food in that book until I got fortunately a very good review in the Wall Street Journal, and the guy said, it's the only book about a natural disaster that needs recipes. The House on First Street is not actually on purpose about food. It's the title comes from the fact that about a year before Katrina, I decided to sort of grow up and get a real life, and after years of commuting back and forth between New Orleans and New York and traveling around most of the time and kind of living like a vagabond as a journalist, and I got married. I got married so late that my editor at Vogue said, "I want you to write a piece about being an old bride for the first time." So I was 42 when I got married, and I thought, okay, well, that's just half the equation. I mean, I sold my apartment in New York. I'm like, okay, I'm really going to settle down here, and we need to buy a house. I got the husband, I'll get the house, and then I'll get the dog. We bought this house. We've been renovating it for a year. We moved in about 3 weeks before Katrina. We're camping out on the third floor, and then, kapow. I didn't realize how much food was in this. I mean, obviously, if you write about New Orleans, it's sort of a no-brainer that food is going to be in there. But until that review, I sort of didn't realize how pervasive it was all the way through. The night before we evacuated, I write about the fact that it was going to be the first dinner party we had in the house. And everybody was like, "You have got to get out of town, blah, blah, blah." And I was so obsessed with the house, I sort of wasn't paying any attention to the fact that the hurricane was coming, like a lot of people. And when I went to the grocery store, I realized that there was like no cars in the parking lot at Whole Foods, which is, should have tipped me off right off the bat. You can't ever get a parking space there. And then I'm driving back, and there are all these people in line at the gas station, and I get in, and my husband has never evacuated for a storm in his life, so we have to go. And I'm like, no, we're having this dinner party. And we did. Alas, in the dinner party, we had lobster, and the last thing that we were doing when we left was having an argument about whether we should leave the lobster shells in the garbage bag outside the house or inside the house. And I said, I don't want it to blow. The garbage bag, it'll blow all around. Our neighbors will land in our yard. They'll hate us. Like that was going to be the biggest problem that we had, with some lobster shells landing in somebody's yard. But this is the kind of weird stuff you start obsessing about when you evacuate. Unfortunately, I won the argument. We left the damn garbage bag inside the house. But so we had the dinner party. We finally leave. We went up to my hometown of Greenville, Mississippi, and we, like everybody else, thought that we dodged the bullet, and so we wake up Monday morning, and it's like, oh, great, which is horrible, because every time you dodge a bullet, it means that your neighbor to the east or west of you has taken the brunt of it. So I'm like, oh, well, the poor old Gulf Coast, too bad. And we lost electricity even that far north. So we decided, we couldn't cook. And so my mother's like, I know that Doe's, which is this legendary steakhouse in my hometown, Doe's Eat Place, and I recommend that you all get in the car and drive to Greenville, Mississippi before you die to eat there. And they didn't have electricity either, but my mother's like, don't worry about it. They got gas stoves. I know that'll be running. So sure enough, we pull up, and it's pitch black dark in there, but you can kind of see the flames of the broiler and the steak grease all flying around from the car. So we jumped out, and it's a scary place, Doe's, without electricity, because it's basically sort of a leaning over tinderbox, really. I mean, it's like this ancient wooden structure. And so for candlelight, they had no candle. They have these mixed mashed of drinking glasses anyway, so they've sort of collected by, I think, people leaving them in there, and because you have to bring your own booze to Doe's. And so in all these mixed match water glasses, they're like cheap tapered candles from the grocery store, and it's like, any minute I just knew the place was going to go up in flames, but we decided to brave it, and we toasted our good fortune, and it was like, oh, great, and we had this incredible meal, and there are all these other evacuees from New Orleans, and we're sort of cheering ourselves on. And the next morning, my mother's like, get up, the whole city's underwater. And my mother exaggerates a lot, so I just rolled over and went back to bed, because I just thought she's lost her mind as usual. And the only reason I got up was finally I got up just to go make fun of her. And then I walked in the kitchen, and sure enough, the whole city was underwater. And that was the moment when we set about putting on what everybody in New Orleans refers to as the Katrina 15. Because there was nothing to do for the next 10 days but stand in front of the TV and drink and eat. By 11 o'clock, my mother said, "You think it's too early to open some wine?" And my husband was already like in the refrigerator. So that was the beginning of the long, slow boil. You're watching everything completely come apart before your eyes. So what are you going to do? You have to eat. Everybody just starts cooking out of nervousness, which I think I do think that's a uniquely Southern habit. When something bad happens, people just start bringing you food. And sure enough, our neighbors, they knew that we lived there, so our neighbors started bringing over like caramel cakes and hams and things. It was like we were having a funeral. The most hilarious thing during our evacuation period was I walked in the kitchen at one point, and my mother was in charge of feeding the evacuees. We had like 800 people sleeping on the floor of our convention center in as far north as Greenville. A tip, if you ever do evacuate somewhere for a hurricane, go to my hometown, because if my mother is in charge of feeding you, you're going to be really lucky. I walk in that room, and she's on the phone with this woman, and she's like planning the menu for dinner that night. She says, "Well, I think we're going to have some fried chicken. And, the Arkansas Traveler tomatoes right now are so beautiful." And I said, "What? You're going to slice tomatoes for 800 people?" And she goes, "Yeah, I'm going to peel them too. Baked beans and potato salad, you name it." They were doing it every night. So I started going over to the convention center and eating with them too. About a week of this, I thought I was going to go crazy watching TV and eating and drinking like a mad woman. So about a week into it, I thought, okay, it's time for me to go back in there, and I had to write about it anyway. So a friend of mine who's a farmer from the Mississippi Delta has a house in New Orleans for the weekend. So my husband and I sort of caravanned in with him, and he had a big old truck. But we had every single thing you can imagine. We had wrenches to turn off. We had a long list of people we were supposed to turn off their gas. We were supposed to clean out refrigerators, which is a very thankless task. So we were going in, and we had all these tools. We had everything under the sun. We had extra gasoline. We had, face masks. We had everything you're supposed to have for a disaster. But we forgot to bring food, because it never occurs to anybody to bring food into New Orleans. I'm always carrying food out, and people are asking me to bring them some shrimp or some crab meat or some red beans or whatever when I lived in New York. So it never occurred to us to bring something in there, so we were starving to death all day. One of the first people I went to see was my crazy friend Bob Rue, who's a character in the book. He's a rug dealer from New Orleans, and he never leaves during the storm. So there's Bob. He has a shop called the Saruk Shop on St. Charles Avenue. And he was hunkered down in there, kind of going back and forth between the Garden District house of his girlfriend and his shop. And you may have even seen him on TV, because he put two huge plywood window, boarded his windows with plywood sheets, painted them white, and then wrote, "Don't even try. I'm inside with a big dog, an ugly woman, a claw hammer, and 2 guns." And it's like, so. And then the next day, he put another sign up saying, "Woman gone, dog gumbo on the stove, still got the claw hammer." Anyway, Bob was very helpful, because his block was the only one that wasn't just smashed to smithereens. He put a looter's shot sign on Delmonico's, which is one of Emerald's restaurants that's next door to the Saruk Shop. And weeks afterwards, and Delmonico, I might add, was not looted. The Smoothie King a block away was looted, but Bob's mean signs did the trick on his block. So nobody touched Emerald's. It was pristine, and they sent like 3 or 4 weeks into it. I was standing outside the Saruk Shop with Bob, and this little girl pulls up, and she's a representative of the Emerald's Corporation. And she pulls up, and she's like, "Oh my God, this is not the message that the Emerald's Corporation would like to send, this looter's shot sign." But there's no paint in New Orleans, so she can't do anything about it. And there's no store open. So she drives like all the way to Houma, gets some paint, comes back and paints it out. So now there's this like little pristine white patch. As soon as she left, somebody came over and wrote, "Emerald is a wuss" on the top of the sign. And he was a wuss. He didn't reopen for months and months after the storm. But anyway, so Bob just he'd been living for the last 2 weeks or a week on this. He'd just taken everything out of his refrigerator and made this big old pile of soup that just kept on going and going on his gas stove. And so he also was really well outfitted with wine. So when we pulled up to his house, keep in mind that half the city was still underwater. It's about 150 degrees outside. The only people in the town are the National Guard, thank God. So there's Bob in the middle of this total disaster zone, and he's standing on his front porch, and he's got a dog on a leash in one hand and like a big old magnum of wine in the other. And I'm like, how did this happen? Well, Bob had been sleeping naked on his front porch to get a little, it was really hot, I'm telling you. And so he hears this noise outside. It's pitch black. I mean, there are no lights on, obviously. And so it's pitch black. He hears this noise, and he kind of peers through the darkness, and there's a guy with a flatbed truck who is stealing his across-the-street neighbor's vintage Porsche, and this guy is obsessive about his car. So Bob sort of rolls over and grabs his girlfriend's pistol out of the bedside table drawer, and let me tell you about Bob. Is like 6'5". He's a little rotund. He's bald-headed, but he's got some hair growing down here, and he keeps it in a long ponytail. So he's pretty remarkable sight in the best of times. But I mean, he's naked in the middle of, it's in the middle of nowhere. He would completely freak you out. So he says, so this guy's sitting there busy stealing the Porsche. He's got all these cars on this flatbed truck. He's been running around town looting. And Bob says, "Hey, partner, which way you want your hair parted?" And he's like pointing the pistol at the back of this guy's head. Thank God, the guy probably would have had a heart attack if he could have actually seen the visual of Bob. Would have been more than he could have taken. But the voice out of nowhere and the promise of getting his head blown off made the guy drop the Porsche. So Bob then, the next morning, went about and he sort of hid the Porsche. He got some old rug pads and put another looter's shot sign on top of the Porsche and everything. And there were looter's shot sign all over our neighborhood. He was a great one-man patrol. He has this ancient Bell South, landline that doesn't require electricity. So he called the guy and said, "I saved your Porsche, by the way." And the guy was so grateful. He told him how to get into his house, and he had this amazing wine cellar. And the wine was going to go bad anyway, so he told Bob just to go and get everything he wanted. So we were drinking this unbelievable, these incredible Burgundies from the 60s. I mean, it was just unbelievable. So there's Bob. He has this magnum of Bordeaux and stuff in his hand. We were pulling up, and he's like, "Would you like some almonds?" I'm like, it was just, you just can't believe. I mean, Willie Morris has always said about the South, it's the juxtapositions that get you. And in New Orleans, there's nothing. I mean, the juxtapositions are greater than most places. But in post-Katrina New Orleans, immediate post-Katrina New Orleans, the juxtaposition of Bob and he'd rescued this dog, and he had all these pet dogs running around. It was very festive over at his house, I must say. I have this lovely cousin who lives in Baton Rouge, and so, I commuted here to spend the night every night, and then we'd go back to New Orleans, and I was running around doing whatever I was doing. So I said, "Bob, I'm coming back at dawn in the morning. What can I bring you?" So I'm thinking he's going to say, batteries or water or something normal since the storm has just barely left us. And he goes, "I need some ice and some garlic powder." So, because he wanted to pep up his suit. When I came back in the next morning after leaving Bob and bringing his garlic powder and ice in, what I was going to do is go out with the National Guard to write about it, obviously. And it dawned on me that these guys were having nothing to eat either. Like the rest of us, they were eating MREs, which just seemed to me wrong in New Orleans. You can't let a guy live on MREs, and they had to come to save us after all. They were the only people who did. So I made it my mission to feed the National Guard because you feel so helpless. And again, it's all about the sort of power of food and nourishment, because there was nothing I could do about the fact that, the city had just been devastated, all that kind of stuff. But I could make these guys happy. And of course I did have an ulterior motive, because the first thing I did when I bought them some food is tell them where our house was. Be sure and watch this house. Podna's Barbecue is a place in town that I'd never been to in my life, but I just saw a billboard driving back and forth all the time. So I just called the number, and I had no idea. I thought it was this huge establishment. They had a billboard after all. And I called them, and I said, "I need barbecue for 1,200 people." Well, this guy was so excited, you would have thought. And I pulled in there. They had stayed up all night. It's like a little tiny thing adjoined to a gas station, or at least the one I went to. And they had pulled in every single one of their staff members from Podna's across Baton Rouge and stayed up all night making this barbecue. And then I said, "I'm so sorry. If I'd known you were such a small operation, I wouldn't have asked you to do this." And he goes, "Honey, don't worry about it. We're closing today. We don't have to come back to work for a week because we've made our quota." So it's anyway, the National Guard was thrilled to see us, and so that became sort of, all the journalists in town made it their mission to keep on feeding these guys. And my colleague Chris Rose, who wrote some amazing stuff, I think he's talking here today, his column in the Times-Picayune for years after the storm was just incredible, and it collected them in a book that you all should definitely buy. And he was running around the French Quarter doing some reporting in the early days of the storm, and confirmed what I've always thought about Antoine's, one of the great temples of Creole cuisine in New Orleans. Well, I've been saying for years that everything in there tastes like it's frozen. Well, sure enough. So the freezers at Antoine's were chock full of fish and fillets and crab meat and all this stuff. So it was all just getting ready to melt and like roll down Bourbon Street. And Chris, the wall had fortunately sort of come down on one side of Antoine. So Chris just went in there and availed himself of everything that was about to thaw out of the freezer, went and stole all his neighbors' charcoal grills and set up this huge grilling station in Audubon Park uptown and grilled all the contents of Antoine's freezers for the California National Guard, which was up in his neck of the woods. So they were all well fed. You know, the first people to come into the town were actually the cooks. And there's a line in my book where I wrote that it was the chefs who saved us. It was the chefs at restaurants like Herb Saint and Upper Line and Lillette and places all over town that I'm sure some of you have visited, who had nothing. I mean, who dipped in their savings or borrowed money, and kept everybody on the payroll even when they couldn't get back, and came in. And Donald Link, who's the chef and proprietor of a place called Herb Saint, which is an incredible, delicious restaurant, he was the first white tablecloth restaurant to reopen. It was literally like a month and 2 days after Katrina hit. It was like having it was like a community center, because it was where people could go to find out, like, how'd you do? Is so-and-so okay? Are you coming back? Are you staying in Houston? It was the place where you sort of like a community bulletin board. It was like a giant cocktail party also. I mean, people were spilling out on the street. We were just so happy to see each other. I mean, I remember going to the ladies' room and I heard this woman saying, "Oh my God, it's so great to see people." Because there was nobody on our street, not just our block, for months, because most of the people in our neighborhood had kids and the schools didn't reopen until January. So if you wanted to see civilization in a town where the lights still weren't on in most places, it was the restaurants. They were like literal beacons. They had electricity and you could sort of see this glow in the distance, and there they were cooking amazingly and nourishing us. They served as examples of if these guys have lost everything and are going to come back with nothing and take a big chance and open up and work like hell, then I can do it too. I remember being on Charlie Rose right after the storm, and he had 4 or 5 people from New Orleans on there, journalists and other people saying, do you think New Orleans is going to be, when it's rebuilt, well, when? We're still waiting for that. But anyway, when it's rebuilt, is it going to be like Disneyland? I mean, everybody had this big image of just like the whole city, all the character just being kind of plowed under, and these new gleaming structures of, sort of looking like Disneyland being rebuilt. Well, of course, that hadn't happened for good and bad. But, and I said, y'all, you can't, you can almost flatten us. But, the same stuff that made New Orleans what it was in the first place is going to bubble back up. And sure enough, it started with the food, and then the musicians came back and all that kind of stuff. It really did save us. I write the food and drink column for Newsweek. And so last month, right after the anniversary, I decided to sort of do an assessment of what the food landscape is like in New Orleans now. And it's kind of amazing because, like I said, since the restaurants were the first people up and running, they proved to other folks that, this was a great, no matter what else happened to the economy, if you could cook, it's not a bad place to be or make a living. So we have a much sort of more varied and sort of deeper restaurant scene than we used to have. I mean, we're known for places like Antoine's and Galatoire's, and then these newer restaurants like Upper Line and Herb Saint, which are becoming sort of landmarks in their own right. But now we have, there's a couple that came and decided they went to Tulane, they became bankers, probably making a lot more money than they are now as cheesemongers. They decided they were working at a bank in London. They decided they wanted to learn the cheese trade. They go work at some cheese, like some 300-year-old cheesemonger in London, and then they're watching Katrina on TV, and they're trying to figure out where in America they were going to open up their shop. They were thinking Philadelphia, not a bad place, Boston maybe, San Francisco. I mean, all those places, sort of reasonable places to open a cheese shop. New Orleans does not exactly have a long history of munching on some cheese because, as this guy said, if you're eating like etouffee and all this stuff, you don't have a cheese platter for dessert usually. But they decided, it sort of just drew them in. They're like, we want to go back there. That's where we want to do it. So, and they're doing incredibly well. They're educating people on the joys of cheese plates. We've got like 10 new gelato places, all kind of specialty shops where people have just decided, this is where I want to make my living. And believe me, I'm eternally grateful. And then restaurateurs like Donald Link that I mentioned, John Besh, who I'm sure you've heard of because he was almost the Iron Chef. He was a runner-up on Iron Chef, and does a lot of good stuff for the state. He's opened. They've each opened like 2 new restaurants since the storm, and are thriving. I mean, it's hard. I mean, Gustav did another wallop to him, because you lose a week of business in the restaurant business. It's a huge blow, but they're not giving up, and then we have, of course, the gift of the Mexicans came in to help rebuild the place, and thank God, because I don't think I'd still have a roof yet. But anyway, typically, all the guys are running around putting up people's, like my roof up, and so the women start these Mexican food stands to feed all the Mexican laborers, and they were so delicious. My painter turned me on to one that's now, it started out as like the back of a pickup truck, then it became a little stand, and now it's like, it has a permanent home, and where you used to go buy like cigarettes and pay for your gas in the middle of an abandoned gas station. They have this airbrush sign, Chaparral Patio. It's the best Mexican food I've ever had. My painter, even though he doesn't paint for me anymore, we still have a standing lunch date there once a week. So we've got all these great Mexican restaurants now, but I love the fact that, even no matter what happens when you get to New Orleans, you still get sort of Creolized, and so the Mexicans are already starting to we're absorbing them into our food culture. And my favorite thing was, I went to this Mexican restaurant not long ago called El Gato Negro, which is the black cat, and it was in the quarter, and I walk in, and on the menu they have Satsuma margaritas. Well, Satsuma's and let me just say, it's worth the trip to get the Satsuma margaritas. But anyway, so that, that's where we are right now. And there are a lot of things in the book that don't have to do with food. But since I was combining this thing, I thought I would take a leaf from my Wall Street Journal reviewer and say, it's true, I should have had recipes in there. But the good thing is that the thread that continues to be our salvation are these cooks. When Gustav came, Commander's Palace didn't have any electricity, so the chef just went in there and he pulled everything out of his own freezer. He didn't wait for Chris Rose to come steal it, and grilled it out front for all the first responders and stuff. And it's such a happy sight. And again, first day after Gustav, Stein's Deli, which is a new, we never had a Jewish deli in town for the last 50 years. And he came and reopened he first opened after Katrina. He was the first guy to reopen after Gustav. There he was, making pastrami sandwiches and matzo ball soup for everybody. So, like I said, it was a welcome sight when I drove back in from Gustav, and I could smell literally 3 blocks away the grills from Commander's Palace. I knew we were going to be fine again, and it was the chefs who saved us. So I urge you all that are not from New Orleans to come and avail yourselves of all this new activity in the food community, and that's it.
Louisiana Book Talks is produced in cooperation with the Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana, and made possible in part by a grant from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. This program is a production of Louisiana Public Broadcasting.